So, another snow day. If you're watching this, obviously we are not having class today. However, rather than having some extra e-learning activity, I want you guys to watch this video and use it to help do part of what we would have done in class today, which is to finish going over the Chapter 8 reading notes and to talk about 8.6, because that was your homework over the long weekend, to fill in the boxes for 8.6. So I'm going to go over that in this video and talk about some of the things you could have had down. I want you to check what you had and elaborate, revise, and just make sure that you've got some of these important ideas about the social changes that took place in the early part of the 1800s. If you've got a printer, it would be great if you went ahead and printed after you watch this video and make changes and then add visuals in. But if you don't have a printer at home, that's okay. You can print as soon as you get back on hopefully Thursday, and we'll add in some visuals, okay? And then after we have a chance to go over that, then I'll talk a little bit about what I also want you to do, because I want you to go ahead and do the homework assignment that's due Thursday as well, so you can turn that in. So let's start off by taking a look at the different boxes for 8.6. So the first box you had in 8.6 was about the Second Great Awakening, right? The Second Great Awakening inspires reformers. So it would make sense to make sure you have at least one bullet point kind of explaining what the Second Great Awakening was. So hopefully you've got one. If not, make sure that you add one. And if you add an extra bullet point, that's fine, okay? But the Second Great Awakening, what we need to know about that was it was a what they called a religious revival movement, right? It was basically just a period in which there were a lot of religious meetings and speeches where a wave of religion swept over the country. And it's important for us because the Second Great Awakening inspired these reform movements that you read about. So I'm not, I don't care that you know a ton about the Second Great Awakening, but what you should understand is that these religious speeches and parades and things like that were going on really inspired a whole bunch of people to try to improve their own lives and also try to improve society. And so you get all of these reformers who want to make society better. And the whole rest of 8.6 is about the different areas where reformers tried to improve society. So in that first box, you might have had something about Dorothea Dix. She was one of the most famous of the reformers. She was inspired by the Second Great Awakening. And the area where she's best known for reforming was in prisons and the way that we treated the mentally ill. So she went in and helped to reform prisons and to make sure that we were treating prisoners more humanely, and also to make sure that we weren't putting people who were mentally ill in prison next to, like hardened criminals. So she plays a really important role in reforming our prison system and reforming the way that we treat and take care of the mentally ill. Another bullet point you might have had in that first box was education. And it mentioned a man named Horace Mann and how he pushed to establish free public education, right? I mean, we just take that for granted today. But again, where did it come from? We go back and we look at the early 1800s. People like Horace Mann said, education needs to be reformed. It should be a right for every child to have access to a free public education, right? And that's just part of our culture today. It's part of our society. The third bullet point you might have had or could have had as a bullet point was about the Temperance Movement. And the Temperance Movement is all about moderation in the consumption of alcohol. So a lot of these reformers looked at crime and poverty and things like that. And they said, the abuse of alcohol has a lot to do with that in our society. And so they pushed for temperance, right? Which doesn't necessarily mean eliminating alcohol, but more of raising awareness of the problems that result from the abuse of alcohol. And so the temperance movement starts as a result of this second Great Awakening. Okay, so any of those bullet points that you had in there would be fine. Second box, reformers push to abolish slavery. It mentions that arguably the most important, the most significant reform movement of the early 1800s is the Abolitionist movement, right? And so the Abolitionist movement simply refers to the push to abolish or eliminate slavery in the United States. So you might have simply had that. You might have mentioned that as the demand for slave labor increased across the South, that was met by an increase in the abolitionist movement in the North. You could have had some names in there, right? Like Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was arguably the most important abolitionist, right? He was a former slave himself who had escaped to freedom, and he gave speeches and wrote articles, even wrote an autobiography to raise awareness of the issues of slavery and the cruelty of slavery and try to help get it ended. You might have mentioned that as the abolitionist movement grew, sometimes violence broke out, where you would have supporters of slavery attacking abolitionists, breaking into abolitionist newspapers and burning them down or destroying the printing presses. So supporters of both sides sometimes ended up, attacking or violence broke out. But certainly the abolitionist movement was a really important and is going to continue to be, as we get closer to the Civil War, the most important social issue of the time. Third box, the women's rights movement. You go back and you look at the push for women's rights and look back at when did women really start saying, all right, we're fed up with being second-class citizens. We're fed up with not having the same rights. So you might have had bullet points like, hey, women were denied a lot of the same rights that men had, such as the right to own property or the right to vote. You might have mentioned some names like Elizabeth Stanton or Susan B. Anthony, who were important women's rights reformers, right? Certainly you need to have a bullet point about the Seneca Falls Convention. This is one of our vocab for the unit, right? This was one of the first major meetings to call for equal treatment between men and women and greater rights for women. You might have mentioned something about the Declaration of Sentiments, right? At this Seneca Falls Convention, they wrote up this document modeled on the Declaration of Independence, called the Declaration of Sentiments, to publicly declare, hey, we think men and women are created equal and women deserve equal rights. You could have mentioned the fact that the Seneca Falls Convention kind of kicks off the women's suffrage movement, really pushing for women to get the right to vote. And even though women are still not going to get equal rights for a long time, and there's still, even in our society today, areas where women are not treated equally. If we look back and say, well, where did this kind of first come about in American history? Again, we go back to the early 1800s, okay? So, go back and rewatch or pause at different parts if you need to add a little more to your boxes, okay? But make sure you've got at least 3 good bullet points in each of those 3 boxes. If you've got a printer at home, print it and go ahead and add visuals. If you don't, that's okay. You can print it when you get back to school. The other thing I want you to do, in addition to finishing up 8.6, is to go ahead and do homework number 7, right? There's nothing about homework number 7 that you need to be in class for in order to do. now that we've gone over section 6. It's kind of an end of chapter, big picture thinking, okay? And so I want you to answer those 3 questions for homework number 7. And I want a well-written paragraph for each. So that's 3 paragraphs, okay? And a well-written paragraph isn't like, all right, well, I guess 4 sentences and each sentence has like 5 words in it. That's really basic, okay? You need to be pushing yourself to be detailed and explain what you believe and what you know and use facts to back you up, okay? So the 3 questions. First, what group or groups of Americans seemed to gain the most opportunities from the changes that took place between 1800 and 1850? All right, what group or groups gained the most opportunity? And give specific examples that show how. All right, so you should easily be able to come up with a good paragraph there to explain that. Question 2, the second paragraph, is sort of the flip of that. What group or groups seemed to gain the least opportunities from the changes that took place? And give specific examples that show how they missed out on those opportunities. And then the third paragraph, third question, is a little bit more about today. That might be a little harder to answer, but just kind of think about it for a little bit. What sort of opportunities are available to Americans today? All right, give at least 3 specific examples. So think about geographic, political, social, and economic opportunities, right? Being alive in the United States, an American citizen in 2018, what sort of opportunities do we have? You don't have to talk about all 4 of those areas, but you know, at least 3 of them, right? What are some geographic opportunities that we have? Political opportunities that we have? Social opportunities that we have? Economic opportunities that we have that maybe people 100, 200 years ago didn't have, okay? So answers to all 3 of those, all right? I'm going to be looking for completed 8.6 notes, and I'm going to be looking for homework number 7 when we come back to school. Thanks. Bye.